All right, I started recording. Hopefully that is happening correctly. If not, well then that's Seb's problem, not mine. Cool. Hi guys, my name is Grace. I am your chair for this round. Congratulations everybody for making it to the quarterfinals. Woo! Big. My preferred pronouns are she or they, but please do obviously refer to the panel as a whole. Judging with me in the order that they appear is
Alexander, he, they.
Shashwat, he, them.
fantastic. Starting from opening government.
Fiachra speaking first. Hear him, please.
Bev speaking second. They, them exclusively, please. Thanks.
Opening up.
Velina for she, they.
Alek second, no preference.
Closing government.
Henny speaking first, she, her. Hillary speaking second, also she, her.
And finally, closing opposition.
Eli first, no preference.
Ram second, no preference.
All right, cool. Without further ado, I welcome the Prime Minister to open up the debate. Here.
Sorry, let me set a timer. Seb may try and convince us all that the draw was random for the quarterfinals, but it feels slightly targeted that there's two Irish teams trying to propose this motion. What are we going to do? First of all, let's do some framing as to why, one, what the issue is in the status quo, and then two bits of mitigatory framing saying like why firms will always be attracted to work in the EU, but why smaller, less wealthy nations will also always have a competitive advantage when competing with others. Then we're going to do three things. We're going to talk about EU rivalry, how like corporations in the status quo have a massive power incentive and power asymmetry and can turn countries against each other when it comes to setting tax rates. Secondly, we're going to talk about tax avoidance and reliance. This is where we're going to get selfish, talk about Ireland and talk about why actually Ireland has suffered quite a bit and why this harm can be done onto other countries in the status quo. And then finally, other attractions, how the bargaining power that I have as a smaller state to the EU is mitigated quite a bit when the EU can just respond with, well, set your tax rates lower. Let's talk about this. What's the issue? The issue in the status quo is that there is a race to the bottom with corporate tax rates, meaning more EU rivalry between nation states, meaning more tax avoidance is taking place, and meaning more undue influence for massive multinational corporations, undue influence they hold above the government states for the nations we're talking about. Let's do two bits of mitigatory framing before I get into my substantive. First of all, firms will always want to compete in the EU and operate in our market. Why is this the case? One, there are just hundreds of millions of people living here. Those hundreds of millions of people consume a lot of products, but also consume a wide variety of products, meaning any firm assessing whether or not they want to set up in a new market can be reassured that there's a lot of people consuming a lot of different things in Europe. And notably, a lot of those people in Europe are quite wealthy, so they can afford, even if the firm is selling an expensive product, for them to sell it. But there's also a lot of producers in the EU. That is to say, if I'm setting up as a technology firm, I know there are a lot of other businesses in the EU that will buy my tech product, that will buy my engines, that will buy my light bulbs, whatever. There is a massive amount of consumers, there's a massive amount of producers. A lot of them are wealthy. This is why firms will
Did he freeze for you too? I'm guessing by the looks of the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Three things. One, land and services being much cheaper. That is to say, there's
Opening
less
government.
firms existing in that
Sorry,
market.
Prime Minister, just pausing you for a second. You did freeze, and I think it was for a decent enough amount of time that people are confused about what you said. The last thing that we heard is that there are lots of producers in the EU, and they're likely going to still be here because they want to like buy your light bulbs and stuff.
Okay, stunning. I'm going to throw my video off then for the rest of my speech just to ensure stability.
That's perfectly fair.
What time was I at on your guys' clocks?
I have you at about 2:05-ish.
2:05. Okay, stunning. Basically, the end of train of thought with producers is that there exists a lot of producers that are willing to buy goods as well. There are a lot of people buying stuff in the EU. Therefore, new companies will always want to set up here. Let's talk about less wealthy regions and why they have a competitive advantage. I think land and services are much cheaper in undersaturated markets. That is to say, if I'm Apple setting up in a new country, I could set up in a country where Microsoft and Intel exist, but I am competing for office space. I'm competing for building services. I'm competing for the labor force against existing bodies and against existing corporations. This makes all of the things that I'm buying, builders to build my offices, the land itself, the labor in order for me to hire them, are all much more expensive to build. Even if it comes at a cost that the universities I'm working in aren't as prestigious in like a less well-off country, I still have the huge competitive advantage that they are much cheaper to pay up front. Therefore, it's probably cheaper for me to take them in, upskill them within the Apple community, and then pay them the competitive wage that exists within their nation, as opposed to a much more wealthy nation. Like I don't have to compete with London wages or Paris wages. Yeah, and therefore less saturation in the market just means that I'm competing with less marketers in that country. I can sell more of my good as compared to other countries where I have to compete with a lot of other people selling a lot of other goods. Let's talk about EU rivalry. Look, I think how do these negotiations play out? That is to say, as Apple, how do I gain a low corporate tax rate? I think a lot of countries have like flexible corporate tax rates, which they will offer to bigger firms if those firms tend to promise more employees. That is to say, like if I as Apple approach the Irish state, hypothetically, complete hypothetical, and say we will hire a lot of people, then you should give us a really low tax rate. Why is this not useful for EU harmony? It means that like with the liberty to change tax rates comes pressure from massive companies to government ministers in order to give them a beneficial tax rate. How these negotiations play out, it's not perfect information for the ministers in charge. So usually the Minister of Finance or the Minister for State is deciding this. What this means is Apple can approach the Irish Minister for State and say, we're willing to set up here, but we're only willing to set up here if you charge us a 10% corporate tax rate. And then Apple can go off to Belgium and say, we'd also like you to set up here for the corporate tax rate. If I, as the Irish Minister for Finance, know that Apple is considering setting up in a multitude of countries, I can ring the other ministers and check if they are doing it. But the information asymmetry is fragile. That is to say, I could ask the Belgian Prime Minister or the Belgian Minister for Finance what they are getting charged. But in doing so, I would have to either reveal the tax rate I am getting charged, allowing them to undercut me, or the Belgian Minister of Finance would just refuse straight up because they know that if I know what they're being charged, I will undercut them. This is just bad for EU harmony at quite a significant point. And the impact is that there's just less diplomacy. There's less people trusting each other on the EU stage. It probably leads to more fights, more disagreements in EU Parliament, and less harmony in when we are voting for stuff such as more grants and more amenities for the countries that like we should support each other in the EU. But at the point at which that country has stolen, in my eyes, the corporation from under me by undercutting my taxes, I'm less likely to vote for their amenities and their grants in the future. Let's talk about tax avoidance and reliance, but I'll take OO before heading on.
Okay, look, I get it. There is cheap labor and all of these types of particular things in these poor countries. But there's also cheap labor in fucking rural France and shit, where there's marginally better infrastructure. Why don't companies go there? What's the unique competitive advantage?
Because at the point at which the labor is probably still more marginally expensive, at the point at which that person who is traveling to rural France could also travel to Paris, or could also travel to Lyon, or could also travel to Rennes, whatever. Like when we're talking about one country, there will always be slightly more saturation. Therefore, undersaturated markets always have a competitive advantage. Let's talk about tax avoidance and reliance. A race to the bottom means countries twist themselves into positions where the corporations have massive power over us. How does this happen? By allowing corporations to pay very low taxes, the state, in order to provide amenities such as public transport and all, are overly reliant on income taxes that the employees of these corporations pay. First of all, I think this is just an undue burden to put on employees, because at the point at which it comes that the corporations can be abusive, that is to say, Apple doesn't pay the money they owe us, Ireland twists themselves in a position to be overly friendly towards Apple in order to keep their employees in the country from the get-go. It means that these corporations have massive undue power over us at the point at which we have allowed them to stay in our countries with low tax rate. Therefore, we are overly reliant on their employees. That is to say, they can get away with billions of dollars worth of tax avoidance. This might be illegal, but it still falls within the motion at the point at which this motion creates more, opposing this motion creates more dependency and creates more harm for these countries in the future. Finally, other attractions. I think myself as a small European state, if I feel like I'm being ignored by the EU Parliament, not getting grants, not getting funded, I can appeal to them and say, look, you will force me to take this lower tax rate. I have done that. I've agreed with that. I have voted in favor of that. Now, can you please support my infrastructure or invest in something in my country? The comparative here being the EU parliament, or like specifically dignitaries within the parliament, can turn around to me in status quo and be like, no, you have the option, lower corporation tax. We will not give you the infrastructure that is necessary unless you abide with us from the get-go. A common EU corporate tax rate means more bargaining power for those smaller countries, because it means no longer can the finger be pointed back at them saying it is their responsibility to cut their own tax income in order to attract business. So proud to propose.
I think the Prime Minister for his fine speech, and I welcome the Leader of the Opposition to open up their side of the House. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are, darling.
Okay, great. I am going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So common corporate tax is not only firstly inflexible, secondly unfair to the smaller nations within the EU, but thirdly, it is only going to cause civil unrest within those countries, raising radicalism and causing people to suffer on ground. 3 arguments in my speech. Firstly, why the tax set is likely to not be beneficial for the smaller countries, literally fucking them over. Secondly, why this removes flexibility to adapt to specific economic situations in the specific countries. And thirdly, as to why this causes growth in Euroscepticism, making the political situations within countries such as Hungary and Bulgaria awful. First, in terms of setup, I just want to mention this. How is this corporate tax likely going to form? It is probably going to be after voting in the EU Parliament, because this is the democratic institution within the EU, and this is like the one institution that passes laws. Note that seats in the Parliament are proportional to how big are the countries within this EU. Thus, France and Germany, and this is factually correct, have way more seats than Bulgaria. Germany has 70 seats, Bulgaria has 15. First argument, why is this tax set likely to not be beneficial for smaller countries? I think that what are the incentives of France and Germany, as I have already explained, as to why they're the main decision makers of what this set tax is likely to look like. We just have to explore their incentives. I think they want to benefit their own citizens more than they want, for example, the EU to prosper. Why? Firstly, this is their primary obligation. As a moral stance, they firstly need to take care of their own citizens. But secondly, and more intuitively, the citizens of their countries are the ones who elect them. The impact certain policies they have on their own citizens is the one that is going to cause for them to get elected or not get elected in the first place. Thus, they want to make them happy, their own citizens, not the EU happy. And for them, high tax is beneficial inside of France, inside of Germany. And this analysis that I'm going to give rebuts the race to the bottom analysis that already comes out of OG. Firstly, they want high welfare because they want to take care not only of the rich individuals within their own countries, they also want to take care of the poor individuals in their own country. And there is no harm to this because they're already healthy. They're not taking so much money from the rich, so the rich become angry with them and don't want to vote for them. No, they benefit everyone. But in countries such as Bulgaria, this is impossible because if you implement higher tax, this means that literally middle-class individuals are going to bankrupt. That's why in like France, it's very beneficial for them because it secures them votes from like all classes, but in other countries, it is not. But secondly, they want to fix more election issues such as education, such as healthcare, which are not the same election issues in Bulgaria. In Bulgaria and Hungary, the election issue mostly is about corruption and not specifically how the healthcare system looks like. That's why they want high tax as opposed to low tax. They want to have the capability to fix all of those things. They're not racing to the bottom with Bulgaria because like genuinely Bulgaria is producing agriculture. They don't want to race to the bottom to that. Now, high tax fucks over poorer nations. And as I explained, probably France and Germany are going to make the common tax higher than it is in countries such as Eastern Europe. And I think all of those countries within Eastern Europe, and not only Eastern Europe, we're also talking about Estonia, for example, they require growth over money currently because they don't have the existing companies within their own countries to make enough money from taxes so they can firstly, have enough taxes generated so they can do welfare, but also the people that are working for those companies to have enough of a purchasing power for them to like live normal lives, but also to drive the economy. I think in those countries, they lower the tax so they can be, they can have more growth. This looks like Bulgaria being the hub of IT companies or Croatia being the hub of consultancy companies. They lower the tax so they can have this. I think that those corporations, if the tax is higher within Bulgaria, have no benefit coming here. They will go to France. Firstly, because the infrastructure there is better, they can have better outreach if the tax is the same. But secondly, in France, there is more upholding the law. So there is no, if there is no benefit to a company coming in Bulgaria, it will not come. This fucks over smaller countries. And I think this is very important because those are the most vulnerable countries where the people are poorest within the EU. So we should focus on them as an impact. This makes a lot of companies bankrupt and companies not coming there in the first place, meaning that a lot of jobs are not now open so that people could have the capability to actually live normal lives. Second argument, this removes the flexibility to adapt to the specific economic circumstances within countries. I think different countries have different economic situations. Some have recession, some have crises, some have bubbles that are likely to pop. For example, inflation within the EU currently is fine, but in Bulgaria, it's still batshit crazy. In like unemployment problem is only in Hungary and no other country within the EU. Different countries have different problems. I think this is because they have internal markets that are protected by some policies by the EU. They have their own stock markets, and one country failing doesn't affect the whole union. That is why they have like different economic circumstances in different countries. It is good corporate tax to be controlled by individual countries because they can increase welfare than they need. They can decrease the tax when they need it for companies to come. And when the EU does it for all countries, it can tailor it to the specific economic circumstances within its countries. And I think this causes more economic instabilities in all states. It is prolonged recession. It is prolonged unemployment because they can now not cope with the problems that they have in front of them. Before I continue with the third argument, I'm going to take closing.
The problem with countries like Bulgaria that you mentioned is that there's still an incentive for countries to want to set up there because of things like lower wage costs, lower renting from buildings. Why would they all of a sudden just abandon everything and go, oh, I'm going to move to France?
Yes, but this is marginal at the point at which you will now have to pay like immense amounts of taxes, but also like Alek is going to rebut this further because I have another argument to run. Why is this going to cause growth in Euroscepticism and why do we care? I think this creates harm upon the people, especially upon small business owners, which are a lot within those countries because firstly, they were communists, so like big monopolies have not yet formed. Secondly, they can get loans from big countries to actually get enough growth to be a monopoly. Thus, like, a lot of small businesses exist within those countries. So in a moment that you actually place a higher tax upon them, a lot of them either bankrupt or they need to downsize, which means they like fire a lot of people. This is harm upon those people. Even if that's not the case, it is a perceived harm because it's going to be portrayed as a sovereignty hit, which it is, like, let's be honest. So we think the impact here is that a lot of countries have a problem with populist powers that are very radical. We are not going to say that we are going to cause some countries to leave the EU, but growing popularity of radical parties is something bad for reasons that Alek will give. Yes, vote us.
I think the leader of the opposition for a fine speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue their case. Here.
Sorry, I'm just going to grab a timer. I'm also really sick, but I'll be fine. Okay. Look, a few bits of extraneous rebuttal before I get into and like rebuild Fiachra substantive and expand on it a little bit. Firstly, when they tell you that, oh, the EU is such a democratic process that some countries will just be outvoted or some people's interests won't be heard. I don't think that's true, primarily because like the EU is not an entirely democratic institution. Vetoes exist. You can veto a policy, like a country could veto a policy because it doesn't necessarily agree with theirs. What does this mean? This means that the EU on things like finance and security, things that are pertinent to like a state's sovereignty, right, are ultimately not decided on a democratic basis, like in the way that like, oh, you can just majority vote somebody. It's a consensus basis. It's like, it's more of like an what's the word? Anyway, the opposite of supranational, basically. But like, it's more of a consensus-based agreement by which like a country can therefore just like be like, oh no, this rate of corporation tax doesn't necessarily agree with us. Therefore, they all necessarily have to come to a consensus on what that rate would be, which means it's likely to just be an average of all of the EU's like corporation tax, or like akin to that. It's probably going to be higher than Ireland's, but probably lower than France's, right? Like at the point at which like those like a veto is necessary, that's essentially like I think why those smaller nations don't necessarily get pushed out, because those smaller nations are equally entitled to a veto on finance and security issues. Right. Okay, I think the second thing I want to respond to is this idea of Euroscepticism. I think this can be very easily ruled out. Firstly, because I think the opposition's case on Euroscepticism is reliant on countries such as Hungary, such as like Poland, etc. Right? I think that those countries already have Euroscepticism for a myriad of reasons, and therefore if you were to impose an equal corporation tax on everyone, or like everyone within the EU, I don't actually think that that's going to exacerbate Euroscepticism so badly, because ultimately that Euroscepticism like is believed in because the values that those people have don't necessarily align with the values that the EU have, right? Generally all over. But that means that if it's not corporation tax, they're going to use some other issue as a scapegoat to bolster Euroscepticism, the way that like, okay, Poland, like if it's not an equalizer of like corporation tax, Poland are just going to be like, the EU like wants to get rid of our like no gay zones, right? And that's a reason for Euroscepticism to be bolstered, because like they're pandering to people who are like homophobic, right? So I think like ultimately like that's not necessarily true. I also think and then like I think that's two extraneous pieces of rebuttal, and then I'll come back. So firstly, I think the Fiachra tells you like the damage to countries who necessarily undercut countries, because I think that's an important one. There is obviously damage to having like an unequal corporation tax upon countries who are undercut, in the sense that like they like get undercut by countries such as Ireland, which are able to attract a load of FDI, and then they're left like, you know, floundering, right? But countries who undercut themselves, such as Ireland, right, like that, who are reliant on these low taxation rates, are actually harmed like ridiculously much as well, right? This isn't just the people who necessarily get outcompeted, it's also the people who are trying to outcompete, because countries like Ireland, etc., are then held hostage by their low corporation rates, because they have now built all of their economic growth upon that attraction to the FDI, because it was an easy way to do it. They could just set 12.5% in country, and companies came in. That meant their jobs and their like revenue was all dependent on the corporations. What does that mean? It means that a company such as like Apple can hold the fact that they have underpaid the Irish state 13 billion euro over the Irish state, and the Irish state will refuse to take it because they want to be seen as favorable to Apple, but also favorable to all the other companies that they want to attract, and like maintain that persona of we have a really low corporation tax. At the point at which Fiachra's framing is true, where like these companies are unlikely to leave the EU because they're such good, like it's such a good market to locate in, because people are generally wealthy, people will buy our products, there's lots of land to produce on, there's lots of like farms and stuff like that, right? And like raw goods. They ultimately, like, at the point at which they can't locate out of Europe, it means that those countries such as Ireland, or countries that are stuck being like essentially held hostage, are able to like bargain themselves that like those over, or like those underpayments, and what's due to them and what they should be able to use. And I don't want to understate this impact, because I think what happens there is like countries such as Ireland get the 13 billion from Apple. Like when we look at it in that way, and like the sheer amount of money that these companies are actually like potentially generating for these states, like Ireland could just be like, you owe me that because there's nowhere else you can go, right? And I think the reason why that's important is because 13 billion could literally change, like overhaul an entire healthcare system in a small EU state, or like ultimately like it like incredibly fund education to the point where like people like have more capacity to like work or do things that generate like other like, or set up like domestic businesses, so it's not like foreign direct investment, right? Okay, countries who are undercut themselves, no, I think, sorry, I want to like touch on what opening opposition say. They say, oh, countries such as Bulgaria with really low taxation rates and stuff like that, they need the low taxation rates because like they need to make this growth instead of like the money, because like, and they have such low purchasing power, like they have to make this growth. If they have such low purchasing power, they have other incentives for countries to locate to them, as long as like no other country can undercut them, right? The reason being is because like they have good competition, like for like they have no competition for labor necessarily, because like other FDI haven't necessarily located there yet. Like also they aren't like, these companies aren't necessarily like competing for infrastructure. They also just have like a lower wages generally. Companies want to do that. They want to maximize their profit in order to like maximize the amount of like expansion they can do. And also like the goods that they're selling probably have like less competition because other FDIs are set up there, right? These low saturated markets are susceptible of like one, they're going to like attract this FDI in this world, but also if without this, like these countries are also susceptible to being held hostage, and like possibly these FDI could still come in and then just be like, oh, we're not going to give you what you're due. I'll take a POI there from closing.
Your mechanism as to why companies go to poor EU countries, even if tax is high, is that they have cheap land and labor. However, if you're only looking for cheap land and labor, why can't you go to China or Southeast Asia, where all of these things
no, we've literally told you why you could possibly locate to China, but at the same time, it is still beneficial to have like some level of your operations in Europe, in the sense that like it is such a massive market. It is literally 450 million people you could possibly sell to and employ in your company, right? Like this is such a massive market. It's also a much wealthier market than necessarily like China or these other countries that necessarily have lower wages, right? Like this is why it is like so much more beneficial. Okay, so I think like our mechanisms just do stand. Like I'm sorry, like companies just do want to attract like low wages. That's why they came to Ireland after the financial crash, because we were decimated, right? That's why we ended up becoming reliant on FDI. I also just think like in order to like be able to compensate for this and make revenue streams elsewhere. Sorry, I'm just gonna check my time there really quick. Like in order to like make revenue streams elsewhere, you have to essentially put income tax on like regular working people, and we necessarily would prefer to put it on corporations because it means it's not taking away from people's wages. And we think that people shouldn't be burdened with that. I know that's probably a lot to get through, and I'm done, so I won't go on to that. But thank you so much.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their fine speech, and welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue their case. Here.
Oh, ow, I hit my leg very hard. Oh my god.
That's officially on the recording, so if you want Seb to get rid of that, make sure you let him know.
I hit my leg very bad, and I screamed out and I cried. It's okay. You would have thought less of me as a man in this particular case. Wow, what is this? Where am I going? Ah, yes, here I am. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So firstly, I'm going to rebut the little things that Fiachra said in this sort of particular debate. Firstly, the deputy as well, I just want to say the word Fiachra. Firstly, they say, but veto is going to happen in this particular case, so at best it will just be the average, between all of the countries. This is fine. Our case still completely functions. Tax rate in Bulgaria still goes up. You still don't have flexibility or basis of competition. It doesn't matter if it's 20, 15%, whatever, it still works in this particular case. This is not a very devastating response in this particular case. Secondly, they say, but tax evasion is high because tax rates are low. I don't understand this connection. Tax rates could be high, they could be low. Either way, you have a symmetrical incentive to collect taxes. You always have the tool of the state that collects taxes. We call them, how do you call them? NAP people in here in Bulgaria, the tax collectors that come and they break your leg in this sort of particular capacity. This always exists because you always need to collect taxes from individuals or from corporations. If anything, the incentive to evade taxes is higher when the tax is higher. It makes more sense to do it. I don't understand why the state doesn't have the capacity to force corporations to pay higher taxes through investigations or any of these particular things. Thirdly, they say, but now small states have big bargaining power because, they'll be like, but we helped you with this one policy in this particular case, or we participated in this one policy, so now you need to give us the grants. Otherwise, they won't give them the grants. I don't understand why this isn't true for any other policy that the EU Parliament may ever do ever in the history of it. Small countries can participate in the helping of anything. Big countries can always find any excuse why they wouldn't give, money to the smaller states. I honestly don't understand what the particular difference here is. If anything, it seems just perception, but I don't understand why states act based upon perceptions. Here's the very interesting thing. This, while sort of hidden, is an incentive debate. If we can prove to you that states have broadly good incentives in how they share their tax, and these incentives differ in this particular case, then we almost win by default, because states will set low taxes when it's a good idea, and they'll set high taxes when it's a good idea for them in this particular capacity. Their only contention for bad incentives is race to the bottom. They say race to the bottom. I do not understand why countries are so desperate for Apple to come there in this particular case that they're likely to race to the bottom. Two responses why this does not function in this particular case. Firstly, as we already proved to you, and they did not engage with, there are many states within the EU that will not race to the bottom. They do want higher taxes. They do not care if Apple comes in this sort of particular case. That they would not sabotage themselves in order for Apple to come in this particular case. This means that these companies don't have bargaining power because states will say no to them, and they likely bargain with very few states, if not even one state in this sort of particular capacity. Secondly, however, this is a self-defeatist argument. The worse it is, the more likely it is that it will get solved in this sort of particular case. If countries really suffer so bad, they will come together and they will negotiate with Apple together because the incentive for this maintains itself. Even if they benefit slightly more now, if they undercut the price, they will hurt in the future. So if their argument is true, states have an incentive to fix this now, to come together and to not allow these terrible impacts that they talk about to occur. So their incentives are likely good in this particular case. This flexibility cannot happen on our side, because on our side, you're forced to always negotiate together, even when it might be a bad idea and when your incentives do not align in this particular case. From here on, we prove that states choose themselves what is best for them and that their incentives are like they never contested why their incentives are on good. Why does this win us the debate? There are three benefits of this, only one which received any engagement. The first two benefits are very simple. There are places where simply lower taxes are a good, useful idea. Like, even if the race to the bottom argument is true, okay, if states race to the bottom, where it is a good idea to have low taxes, where growth is important, like Bulgaria, where we have 10% unemployment rate regularly in this sort of particular case, why is this so bad? These states can now undercut it, where it's a good idea for them to have these types of low taxes. There are places where it's a good idea to have high taxes, like France, like Germany, where you can help out poor people and do all of these particular things, and you can afford to do this. Ergo, we access all of these benefits in both the poorest and the richest countries because they can create most employment where employment is necessary, and because they can, how do you call this particular thing? Because they can create more welfare where welfare is necessary when they have the choice to select themselves. Second impact that they did not respond to. There are simply differing economic circumstances in different countries. Sometimes there are regional industrial bubbles that say will only hit in some countries but not in others. Then it's very important to be flexible with your tax rate, to be able to lower it so you can stimulate growth, or to raise it so you can cash in on existing growth in this particular case. Now this flexibility disappears. Countries deal with regional crises slower, less effectively, less employment, less money within people's hands in this sort of particular thing. Again, absolutely unresponded to. Before I go on to the only one that they responded to, I will take closing.
The issue with your case is that even though regions within France operate differently with different economic benefits or incentives, they can still work together by having one national policy that they follow.
Yes, but that's a bad idea when it's dividing countries, because they want different things and different policies would be better for different countries. Like, you just say this, explain how to me it's a good thing, and then we'll see in this sort of particular case. Only thing they responded to is the thing where poor companies can attract consumers to their own place. Even if this response stands, we still win the debate because these other two benefits are still very big and unresponded to. Why doesn't this response stand, however? It is true that there are benefits to, to being in poorer countries. That there is lower, wages in this particular case, cheaper land. There are also harms to working in poorer countries. Like, there is worse infrastructure in this particular case. There is worse, all of these type of particular things, worse laws and all of this. They, in the status quo, pick the richer countries. Why? Because the richer countries are perceived to be more stable in the long term. Wages rise over time, but infrastructure doesn't necessarily improve in this particular case. Whereas you're far more certain that France will stay as is, that Bulgaria will stay as is. The only way to then fix it is to lower taxes, to attract jobs in places where they're absolutely necessary, where unemployment is high in this sort of particular case. So we deal with the only response to any of our benefits that we give, and we have other benefits, vote us.
I think the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for his fine speech, and I welcome the Member of Government to open up their half of the debate. Hear, hear.
Just want to make sure you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna start shortly. Just get my timer out. Okay. In terms of POIs, actually, I'll try to open the chat. Actually, just do try shout them out because I might not even really be looking at the chat too much. Cool. The first thing I want to point out is the issue that I have with the opening opposition logic. I think essentially what they tell you is that different countries and different regions need to be able to implement their own types of policies and have their own absolute control over these things, given that different countries have different economic systems. I want to note, even within countries, there are vastly different economic systems. Note, for example, take any country that literally has a big urban area and city where a lot of like investment, where a lot of colleges, where a lot of houses and a lot of resources exist, versus the rural areas that tend to be on the other side of the countries with little to no amenities. I think they have very different economic structures due to the types of jobs and systems that are in place there. I think countries are still able to work cohesively with the same blanket policy. I think it's possible to implement policies that can work for general regions overall as a whole. They don't prove the distinction that happens when it happens at a state level, given that even within states, there can be vastly different economic situations. So I just, based on their logic, even countries wouldn't internally work, but I think they still do in a lot of cases, right? But simply, I want to make our extension simply clear here. I think we're going to talk to you about like the issue with FDI is the ability for countries to not be able to pay it back. I think what OG tells you is that they can evade taxes because they can be like, no, I don't feel like it. The issue is this is very implausible. I think corporations still want to have good relations with the countries and just don't want to seem like dickheads. They want to have good relations so that people can be incentivized to give them other types of benefits from from good nature, from having like good connections and things like this. I think what we're going to tell you here and what is something that's more plausible is going to win this. I want to note also their case falls to when OO points out that they don't fully explain why this tax evasion happens. But secondly, another substantive will be explaining and directly engaging with OO, right? I think the issue is OO tells you that these countries ought to have the ability to be able to control their own financial situations. The issue is when you do this, that goes into the hands of politicians. I think I'm going to simply explain to you why at the point where we have a common EU corporate tax, this is likely to be done by an independent large body, for example, the ECB, and why this is better than local politicians within particular countries. I think that's going to be simple enough to win the debate. Okay, cool. Firstly, let's go into the first thing about how like tax evasion and loopholes, right? I think the issue here is that in status quo, the actual plausible reason, better than what OG tells you, for why tax evasion happens is because a lot of countries don't have capacity. I want to note, Alek tells you that there's going to be incentives for countries to want to do good things. And he literally says, quote, I don't understand why countries can't just enforce corporations to pay tax. I think some of them can't. I think some of them have poor legislation. I think some of them have poor capacities. Take, for example, the poor countries that you talk about that are viable to things and issues like corruption. I think what happens here is companies are able to do things like, buy them out for hush money. I think people are able to do things like lobby politicians in places where corruption doesn't exist to a high extent. I think to a high extent, right? I think all of these are the reasons that tax evasion occurs. I think firstly that the lack of a robust legal system means the laws and policies you're able to make are things where companies with large amounts of lawyers, with large amount of capital, are able to find loopholes and things to do. I think this is more plausible than what happens on OG, but I think it also beats the OO rebuttal to this, beating OO as well, essentially, right? So I think the issue is that we necessarily prove why the capacity doesn't happen within these things. I think we're willing to bite the bullet that OO tells us that there might be marginally less FDI. I want to note, though, this is marginal, given that there is still lower land and labor costs. This also explains why OG case is marginal. I think given that there are lots of other ways to compete rather than just corporate tax, I'm unclear as to why this is a tipping point in competition when things like lower land and lower labor still exist. Given this, what it does to the OO case is it also explains why when they say that they get less FDI in particular places, this is also something that is a marginal impact here. I think that there's a marginal impact here. I think regardless of how high you set the tax rates, because I think there was a clash on whether or not there's a race to the bottom, I think this doesn't really matter within the debate. Why? Regardless of how high or how low you set the tax, the issue is for all the reasons that have uniquely come out from CG to be plausible and be able to prove that tax evasion happens to an extent, what happens therefore is it doesn't matter how high you set these at the point where people aren't paying these in full, you aren't paying these in full, you're not actually able to get the money or the benefit from this. So cool, beat opening bench. Now, let's bring in something else to further win the margin of the debate. I think secondly, why politicians in charge of these corporations and these taxes being bad. What does OO tell you? OO tells you that people need to have flexibility to adapt over their economic situations, right? I want to note, why does, even if a recession happens, I won't clear why a recession in Germany or a recession in, I don't know, Hungary looks completely different. I think even if they manifest in slightly different ways, I think, you know, the same issues happen, like people just can't access food or whatever types of things you talk about. But secondly, the root issue is likely to be things that are similar and could be solved from blanket like policies. I think, for example, if things like if people can't afford things due to inflation, there are mechanisms that you can implement to stop inflation that can happen across all types of economies and all types of places. I don't think they necessarily prove why you need to have this. But secondly, if I take them at their best and I say, okay, right, they do prove they're able to get full ability to be able to adapt to economic situations, and they prove why this is necessary and only happens on their side. I think the issue here is at the point where you do this, the power goes in to people like politicians. Why do I think politicians are necessarily bad in these instances? I think one, politicians think in short-term cases. I think they only think about the 4 years in which they're in office. I think secondly, politicians aren't likely to do things like make controversial economic, like financial economic decisions. That is to say, if the unrest and civil unrest and other types of unrest that OO talks to you about, those are the reasons why politicians would want to avoid taking issues which may actually help and resolve things like recession and resolve all these economic turmoils and things that they talk about. I think the reason, I think for that very reason, it means that like the incentives of economic, I've already like proven why the incentives are likely to be good, but I've also proven to our first substantive why capacity is lacking, therefore taking down OO. I will take a POI from closing if they have one, if not opening.
Closing. So like, why would this mean that politicians do not just do worse things, right? Presumably they want to compete for industry, they want to win re-election. They don't control one tax rate. What's the margin there?
Okay, cool. I want to talk about this now. I think what happens is the ability to actually implement, the ability to actually be able to use this. I think what are the benefits of actually getting the tax money from corporations, right? I want to note that this is where marginal change happens, regardless of how much we're able, regardless of how much money or percentage I can actually prove, whatever numbers I can punch in. Why is this the case? I think the impact from getting corporation tax is that it's something that goes back into the government. The money stays within the EU. It means that the local and national governments actually get the money at the point where the taxes are paid. When they're able to get this money, it means you're able to do things like fund public healthcare. You're able to fund public infrastructure. You're able to put clothes on people's backs. You're able to build buildings for hospitals, people. Now, why is this likely to be done by an independent and large body like the ECB? I don't think one particular government is going to be chosen at the point where this has to be something that is covered by all of the EU, right? I think what happens is they're going to implement and select the independent body of the ECB, because the ECB is already known for handling things like taxes and financial and other types of monetary policy, right? I think they're better able for this because they're an independent body. They're not susceptible to all the backlash and things OO talks to you about, which is why they're likely to do actual policies that are better in times of change. But I think at the point where they're just simply harder to evade, corporations are harder to evade them because they have greater capacity to be able to enforce legislation. I think what happens therefore is you're actually able to get this money. I think we essentially proved to you why you actually avoid the tax evasion that happens, and we give you more plausible links in OG, and we simply prove why the incentives and capacities OO talks about are bad and don't exist. Vote CG.
I think the member for government for a fine speech, and I welcome the opposition member to open up their quiz. Here.
Okay. You guys in chat, non-verbally. Closing government is correct about one thing, which is that the ECB will now control one tax policy. There are a lot of policies that governments control. This is one among thousands. And the problem is, at the point where the entire gov bench tells you how vastly important these corporations are, how it's really, really important to keep them, but also how you need to outcompete other countries, the logical end result of that is if you can't control the corporate tax rate and the EU runs that, countries will just do other things, worse things, we will tell you, to attract companies to come there instead of going to other countries. This extension will beat opening government because it will flip their case. It will explain why if we buy their premise, which is that you need these companies so much, then you will compete in vastly worse ways. And so all of the harms about corporate capture and all of the ways that you outcompete other countries and worsen conditions for them are massively exacerbated in their world. let's get into that extension. All responses will be integrated, then some more at the end. The extension is just you get worse forms of competition. And the crucial thing here is that if you can't compete on taxes, you still want to compete with other countries. And I think there's two reasons for this. One, governments get voted into power on the businesses that they draw in, right? It's the most proximate thing for your voters. It's whether or not you have jobs. It's whether or not the companies that come in will build infrastructure, which is often part of the package deal. It's whether or not you're seen as growing the economy because your GDP rises. It's whether or not you have like a stable economy, because when you can attract multinational companies, you can stabilize loans externally insofar as like these companies don't go under. But second, it's literally the basis of your economy. Like PM and DPM both say this. Countries like Ireland are based on FDI. So there's a huge crisis then if the companies leave, which creates a perceptual problem for the government that's seen as failing in a core capacity, which is when everybody believes that the economy should be run on FDI because that's the only thing they've known for 40 years. Even if they could run it some other way, they're not prepared for that, and so punish governments that don't take aggressive steps to keep the economy running through FDI. Why are the changes that you make to keep these companies likely to be really extreme changes? Two things. One, OpenGov literally says it themselves. There are all of these extreme powers of the company in these nations. Like they say it's key to your entire national economy. They talk about all of the political influence that it has. If they are correct about that, then they have the power to force governments into creating massively like advantageous legislation for them that will allow them to stay. But second, lobbying power. Like you have tons of money. You have great lawyers. You can work within the political system to push your case and get whatever legislation you want. And note, this is crucial. This is the political justification for doing bad things as a government, because you can say, look, the EU tied our hands, right? We couldn't do this other corporate tax policy. We had to make a bunch of other changes. That's why we have to do this stuff, even if it's not great policy. What are the other ways you outcompete? Probably it's everything. It's lower environmental regulations. It's lower labor restrictions. It's lower minimum wages, lower capital gains tax and income tax, paying massive subsidies to corporations that come in to pay for their land costs, fund their initial cost of employment, build their headquarters and infrastructure for them out of their government budget. And by the way, this also responds to OpenGov because this is what the EU tells you to go do instead of the EU just voluntarily like giving up millions of dollars in subsidies to developing nations. Why do you not do these things in OP? Because obviously they're costly, right? If you lower environmental regulations, maybe there will be a spill, maybe that will hurt your government and you will lose more parliamentary elections in the future. If there are worker abuses because you voluntarily agreed to police the companies less aggressively, like don't fund your auditing agencies and your labor agencies as much or give them as many powers, then people will complain about that. So this is politically not great, but you do it if you think you have no other choice, right? If these like massive corporate tax rate has been removed, then this is the only other thing that you can do. Any POIs from Top Path here?
So the reason why corporations enjoy such undue influence under status quo is because at any point they can threaten to move, or when they are setting up, establish the tax rate. Your incentives don't change, but we can shut down one avenue of influence.
No. So the problem is that, yeah, they can still do that. There's just like, you have to do more bad things to keep them in, right? So the margin is just different on your side. Instead of doing the corporate tax rate, you will do other taxes. This just means that both of our impacts would be marginalized if that's true, but like it would still beat it. Okay, the reason that it would beat it is that the changes that you make are worse than a race to the bottom. And there's three ways we can prove this. The first one is on exclusivity. Maybe the corporate tax rate is big. The problem is A, it's one tax compared to like 100 others. So there are other ways of balancing your checkbooks, but B, the corporate tax is on where the corporation is based because government set it to apply to the legal jurisdiction that has the authority to tax them based on like where the corporation exists, because logically, like you wouldn't tax them based on where they have one factory in like a random country. You would tax them based on what they produce there, but the headquarters for most businesses are not in developing nations. They're in rich nations where your company was founded and where you can afford the cost of things like building a headquarters in a major developed city like Paris, because you want to do that to attract educated workers to go there, or you want to attract like government contracts, like NATO contracts for Germany if you work in their capital city. The comparative is our harms are unique. Things like worker abuses, things like worse environmental regulations, or undercutting like government spending by doing massive subsidies for companies. There's no other way to check against this. There aren't a bunch of other taxes that you can use to balance that impact. Second, scale of damage. The biggest harm of low taxes is you can't fund state services, like build roads for people, stuff like that. This is A, mitigated by the EU, which directly funds many of those state services through its development bank, because the less poor your nation is, the more other big nation companies can come into your nation population and do well because you have infrastructure, but B, it's not as long-term. Like maybe the road is built slower. Maybe your pension has to extend 5 years and you can't claim it as early. The counterfactual is the land that gets poisoned lasts for like 50 years. You bankrupt part of your government by paying for the establishment costs of companies when they can like force you to spend all of this money. And note, this is also really crucially irreversible. Once you spend that money on subsidizing operating costs, it's gone. Once the spill happens, it's already happened. The counterfactual is you can negotiate taxes long-term because maybe it's lower initially to draw the company in, but once they're set up, you can renegotiate because even though Opening Gov says like you can't do this, the problem is there are massive costs to leaving and uprooting your business. So you probably are willing to make some concessions. Maybe we don't get a perfect tax rate, but we do get some kind of increases long-term on their side. So the impact on Opening Gov is short-term. The third way we can weigh this is just on balancing out the benefits here. Like lower taxes will also allow for things like more business growth. You can open up and move in, so some benefits to that. This balances against harms. There's no benefit to like losing your arm in a plant accident because they didn't regulate strictly enough insofar as the corporation forced them to do this. The last thing we'll do here is just rebuttal to Opening Gov really quickly on information asymmetry. Two responses. One, often details of corporate deals are public because they're seen as a public issue insofar as Opening Gov is correct that they affect the entire nation. So you often do have access to information and opposition parties can hold you accountable. Second, there is state collaboration because the bureaucrats who do these deals have worked with each other for a long time on other EU deals in the past, so they do have trust and believe they can hold the other party accountable and prevent undercutting. This mitigates the extent of the information asymmetry. You do work with each other. There is no race to the bottom.
I thank the member of the opposition for that speech, and I welcome the government whip to close up their half of the debate. Here.
Sorry, I forgot to put my microphone on. So for POIs, I don't mind if people just want to shout them out in the chat. So, and I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. CG's extension here is very clear. Politicians are stupid and unable to make political long-term change. Therefore, the only smartest thing to do is to hand over as much power and a corporation tax and something that is very important to us, to the ECB, who are the super good guys who have the power to collect tax. First thing, onto CO and get them out of this debate quickly. When they tell you that this is only one policy that the ECB can control, so the countries will just like, oh, so then they tell you that because of that, companies will just do worse things, right, to compete. So they'll do worse things, for example, if they can't compete on low taxes, like things like, oh, low labor laws and just basically have slavery, right? Like they basically run a slippery slope argument. Note, why is that untrue? Because there are things that labor laws that exist. It would literally be illegal if these companies were like, well, you can only let us in if you pay us €4. Politicians are not just going to do so because companies tell them that, because it would literally cause massive like France level civil unrest if people were just like, yes, sorry, we're not going to change and lower our minimum wage, would just never happen. No reasonable politician would do it. So I think that CEO probably loses and like loses this debate on plausibility in the fact that their case would never happen if their countries were controlled by any rational actor. Note as well the mechanism that they give you is that because these countries are so extremely reliant on FDI from these big bad MNCs. It means these MNCs can literally do anything. And if we attack them in this one aspect, they're basically going to retaliate and attack us even more. Note, if everything they were saying was true and these companies were as big as bad as they would say anyways, I don't see what's stopping these countries from literally just going crazy and why there's no delta. I don't see why if these companies are as bad as extremely reliant as we say, why these companies just refuse to pay tax if, according to CEO's own like framing of their resources, they have the ability to just pay no tax. They have the ability to literally just like not even pay their workers, and then there would literally be no debate, because that doesn't happen, because the world doesn't work that way. I think at best, right, even if they're saying it, right, at best, I think it's probably a bit better if there is a blanket tax. But why is that? I think it's probably better because like we're probably less reliant on the FDI. So I don't think it's a bad thing that some of the FDI, like who are the bad guys that they talk about, probably leave and go to other places like, oh, China. But the reason the majority will still stay here, and I'm going to give you an actual reason, is because we're one of like the only trading blocks. Like the EU is pretty cool because it means that you can trade into a market of 1 billion people with literally little to no distribution costs, fees, customs, which saves businesses a lot of money. So majority of them would probably still stay here. How do we weigh over CO then? Long-term economic policy means that you have more sustainable growth, which is better because it's less variable, which insulates you from things like economic turmoil that they talk about. And also the idea that these countries can't just go big, bad, and crazy, unfair characterization, completely unrealistic. Now, what do we hear from opening opposition? Note, opening opposition is only real, they gave us 2 main mechanisms, right? But one of their, the first mechanisms that they give us, right, was that, this would never work because countries can't work together because countries have different things and different regional structures and cultural differences. I think my partner has a really good response to this, but I'm going to tell you why that response is so good for this debate. I say that note the logic and how silly this is, because that means countries that are extremely different with urban and different rural areas, for example, take Ireland, where 50% of the population is concentrated in Dublin versus a small town like Laois, where there might be only 100,000 people. They're still able to work together, they're still able to come up with a corporation tax, and they're still able to possibly come up with something plausible. So that means that if you're following the OO premise that the case is based on, no country ever would exist and no country ever would work, because they would never be able to do something because everyone has some amount of cultural and regional differences. I'm unclear what the difference really is because country lines are completely arbitrary things that humans have decided on. Note, right? What does this mean, right? I think that this means the majority of their main pushback on this, yes, EU countries can't work together is out of this debate, as people and politicians are able to delegate. They're able to also have a common good, which is the idea that, yes, I don't want to have a recession. You don't want to have a recession. Let's make something smart for all of us because we have something called mutually assured destruction. 2, what other incentive did OO give us? OO told you that the EU was going to make bad decisions for smaller countries and F them over. The mechanism for this was because France and Germany only care about themselves, right? Note, the only response OG Weekly responded to this was, yes, they can veto. Probably an insufficient response. We're going to fill in that gap here and give you the actual reason why. Worst case, even in France and Germany are stupid bad guys, like OO said, why do they still care? They still want the EU to do well. Why is this? Because they're in charge of it. They've given lots of time to the EU. They've literally been on the board from it. But also because if the EU is doing well and they're in charge of it, it makes them seem more legitimate. It makes them seem more powerful. They wouldn't be a part of the EU. There wasn't anything that they gained from being a part of the EU. So it strengthens them. Even if you don't believe that, a second reason, another mechanism. They don't want smaller countries to fail. Why? Because if you're a part of an EU and you're part of the EU member countries, it's often the bigger countries, like France and Germany that are stuck fitting the bill and that are stuck bailing you out of a recession. Note, for example, countries in crises, for example, like Ireland, who joined the EU, who are a lot smaller. And at the very start, it was mainly France and Germany that were lending the money to build them up. They don't want to be lending money to stupid countries, and they also want them to do well. So that means that they probably do have incentives to make these taxes something that is reasonable for the smaller countries, and they're not going to F them over. What does this mean? I think it means weighing over opening opposition. It means that we probably have proven to you accurately what the EU has incentives to implement things that are better for smaller companies in the status quo. While they might not be as low as these companies want, they would still not be as ridiculous as they would say, and would probably be a lot more reasonable. Before I go on, any POIs for my opening?
Even if you prove that politicians are sometimes bad, that's not your burden. It's to prove that they're bad more often than they're good. This is not a burden that you've met.
Yeah, but we have met the burden that they are bad more often than they're good, because we've told you politicians only work for 4 years and they literally have different incentives. For example, the Labour Party would probably want way less taxes in general, or actually way more taxes for businesses than something, for example, like the Tory Party, because of things that they're inter-party lines, inter-party states. It's not the idea that they're bad people, it's the idea that they're always constantly fighting, always constantly trying to win over things on different, always constantly trying to win over different things. And unfortunately, corporation tax is not the fighting issue for Sinn Féin or Fianna Gael, so it's something that they're way likely to care less about and continue fighting about other things, right? Which I think is why we take it over OG, because OG fall victim to the thing with tax raise to the bottom, which they literally give no other reason for than raise to the bottom. People keep on going low, low, low. We tell you the actual thing, that because political cycles are short-term, messy, and people aren't voting corporation tax because it doesn't seem as proximate, it means that you fall victim to things like, parties just not doing anything. For the idea that conservative parties have a completely different idea of corporation tax and have not reliant. We should be on FDI, the green parties. And for the fact that these countries cycle in and out of power every 3 to 4 years, and economic conditions are things that are created that are often very long term from things that are out of your control. For example, see things like COVID that had a massive effect. See things like the war in Ukraine that caused gas prices to rise. For the reason that economics is long, messy, and politicians are stupid. So glad CG for the win. New meta. Thank you.
I thank the government whip for her fine speech, and I welcome the opposition whip to close up their side of the House and indeed the debate as a whole.
Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Eli's extension was very clear. Sure, the EU now has control over your taxes, but you as a country still want to outcompete everyone for all of the reasons that opening government says. This means you do things such as lowering environmental regulations, weakening labor laws, lowering capital gains tax. And I just want to clarify here, because CG tries to strawman the extension. Obviously, you're not going to do things such as dumping oil into the ocean, because that's not going to be allowed on either side. But you do things that are massively impactful. This looks like reneging on your contributions in the Paris Agreement, which we've seen from many EU countries, doing things as reducing your carbon footprint, reducing subsidies in fossil fuel, and weakening on like green tech, and weakening pressure on fossil fuel companies. The only response we get from CG was, aha, there are existing labor laws and environmental laws that prevent you from doing this. 3 responses. Number 1, many of the poorer EU countries that we speak about don't actually have these strong baseline laws on labor environment. The example of this is Poland literally reneging on its labor protection rules, Greece cracking down on unions, Croatia having massively low capital gains tax. This means that given that a lot of these countries are massively capitalist and want to attract investors for all of the reasons the government themselves identifies, they often have very weak amounts of these pressures themselves to safeguard against these rights. And you can often justify it in the idea of economic growth. Number 2, like even for rich countries, many of these are top polluters. Countries such as Germany and France, for example, often lead in terms of the number of emissions they do. Sure, the progress is happening now because of agreements such as the Paris Agreement, because of multilateral agreements that make things better. But that's where Eli's extension comes in, because now it is easier to justify why we should slow down on our contributions, because we want to be able to, for example, make it easier for corporations to come and things like that. The last thing I just want to say here is that even if all of this is true, this isn't permanent, right? There's the rise of the far right in the European continent. Like, for example, Macron's popularity rating has been dropping recently, and people like Le Pen have been increasingly close towards clinching this. This is not dependent on them winning, but it shifts the Overton window towards even making more concessions, and you give these people even more justification insofar as this policy exists. Let's then deal with each team one by one. Firstly, with opening government. Their first argument is corporate dominance. They say when taxes are lower, countries become dependent on companies. They say this leads to 2 harms. Number 1, abuse. You do things that is tax evasion. 3 responses to this claim. Number 1, this isn't dependent on whether the tax is common or not, right? Like, it's dependent on the strength of the current institutions you have. You will tax evade if you want to tax evade, and that's not dependent on the tax, but on the actual institutions. But number 2, I think I want to flip this. I think you do more tax evasion on their side of the house. The reasoning for this is simple cost-benefit analysis. There is risk associated with tax evasion. You can go to jail. So if the tax is higher, which is what happens on government side, then you are more willing to take that risk. You hire more lawyers. You bribe the tax collector. You do all of that shit because you want to make, because you know it's probably worth it. Comparatively, if the tax is low, it's not a worth it investment to do things that is tax evasion, because you can just pay the tax anyways, which means that if their claim, like this, their claim is probably self-contradictory. Number 3, just intuition pump. If the state is poor and needs taxes, which is their characterization, right? Because you pay low taxes and you need FDI, then why won't it be more proactive in collecting these taxes insofar as they're dependent on them, insofar as it needs money to spur investment? The second impact they talk about is that you tax consumers and employees more. Number 1, Eli already said that this is massively unpopular politically. But I'll go even further. I'll flip this. They say that corporations are powerful. The way I this argument is to simply say, I'll take you later, is that the problem is that corporations don't want you to increase employee tax and consumer tax. There are 3 reasons why. Number 1, it leaves consumers with less disposable income for goods and services, influencing demand for corporate services and goods. Note, this probably applies also to luxury goods such as Apple iPhones and things like that, which they talk about. So you don't want the government taxing your employees and consumers because it lowers your market base. Number 2, workers on their side of the house, if you raise taxes on consumers, demand more wages to compensate the money paid for taxes, right? So labor unions now justify, if you raise taxes on us, we want to demand more wages from corporations. So corporations actively lobby the government not to do this, which by their logic, since corporations are powerful, probably succeeds on our side of the house. Number three, it also stigmatizes corporations because consumers blame the corporations for now having higher taxes because media probably riles it up as a good story. This means that if their logic is that corporations are powerful and they control the government, corporations don't want you to shift the burden on consumers because consumers are the ones who buy your product to begin with. This beats opening government. Let's then deal with closing government. They say tax collection will be done by an independent body, and that the counterfactual is that this is done by politicians. The first thing I just want to say is that this is untrue. The counterfactual is not done by politicians. Oftentimes, tax collection is done by independent bureaucracies. Things such as the IRS in Germany and France and other bureaucratic institutions who are politically designed to be independent through constitutional protections because of every harm that closing government talks about. So it's fundamentally untrue that politicians just massively shift tax rates or just, like allow a corporation to do things such as tax evasion, since a lot of this policy is controlled by independent institutions already existing within those governments. But number two, even if it's controlled by politicians, I'm not sure why they will do the things that are bad for people. This is because number one, it politically looks bad because you're literally looking like you're going against the poor. But number two, because of all the things Eli talks to you about, you do worse stuff on our side of the house to compensate for this, which are easier for you. Nobody bats an eye when you do things that is lowering environmental regulations because consumers are a more powerful consumer group than, let's say, the environmental movement. Before that, opening government.
According to your opening, there will always be scenarios and regions which require certain tax rates. Surely it is the world where you have to compete with neighboring lower taxes and you have to maintain your taxes is the world where these nations are forced to deregulate.
No. The problem is that whether you're competing with neighbors or other countries, it's not dependent on that. It's just that you're competing with other people, so you do things to outcompete them by doing things that is, for example, weakening pressures on fossil fuel companies, reneging on multilateral agreements that makes it so that you don't want to do this. The last thing that I want to do is to weigh this. Like, even if you assume that maybe we get less tax revenues on our side, so you lower taxes, why are the harms of things that is lower environmental regulations probably worse? Two ways. Number one, it's more long-term. The problem with the other side is that maybe you reverse taxes now, maybe you do things that are like that CJ talks about, like because it's a 4-year short-term political cycle, but it probably resolves it that after a new administration takes place. The comparative is environmental harms and labor laws are permanent and are enshrined in law and have a permanent impact on future generations. Number two, on magnitude, the vast majority of these issues, like for example, their side just affects taxes. We affect a vast majority of issues that corporate companies now have justification to control. So yeah, we win over them in general. Very proud to win.
I think the opposition went for his fine speech. I think everybody for their speeches. Yeah, virtually shake hands, etc., and then please go away so we can make a call as soon as possible.